part of the Abbey's history. So this would be during the Middle Ages and into the Tudor period. Glastonbury Abbey became one of the top pilgrimage sites in Europe. So very, very important place. It was also the wealthiest abbey in England. It owned huge amounts of land, and the church here was very, very rich. So let's go right back to the beginning, the story of Joseph of Arimathea. This takes us back to the time of the Bible, and Joseph was related to Jesus. It was him that claimed the body of Christ after the crucifixion and arranged for his burial. And the story that became hugely popular here at Glastonbury Abbey was that in the years after the crucifixion, Joseph came here to this place bringing with him 11 followers, and they stayed and set up the first Christian church in Britain. And the story goes that Joseph brought with him these 11 followers. He came here by sea, up the local river, and moored his vessel.
Thank you, Longer.
And then we're told they walk up Wiriel Hill, which is close by, to get the lay of the land, to see where they'd arrived. And in doing so, the very famous part of the story is that Joseph thrust his wooden staff into the ground, where miraculously it rooted into the earth and flourished into life as a thorn tree. And Joseph took this to be a sign from God that he should stay here and set up the first Christian church in Britain. Now, an extra layer to this story is the tree behind us. This is Glastonbury Holy Thorn, and the story says that that is descended from the staff of Joseph of Arimathea, and it blooms twice a year, a little bit at Christmas time, and then it has proper flowering at Easter, so you're here right as it's flowering. Now, this story of Joseph, clearly we can't be sure that it's true. It was said to have happened 2,000 years ago. There isn't any evidence for it, so we just don't know. It may have happened, it may be just a story. What we can say is it would have been quite possible for Joseph to be here at that time in history. The Romans would have just invaded Britain, and they'd be establishing themselves in the south of Britain, and that might be opening up new opportunities for trade. The stories say that Joseph was a metal worker and a trader in metals, and so he could have been here to trade the tin in the southwest of England, and even the lead and the silver being mined on the Mendip Hills close by. Now, the archaeology, that starts quite a bit later, after the Roman period. There's evidence for a few wooden buildings here in the 500s, but we don't know what they were used for. It might well have been an early Christian community. The monks wrote a number of histories of Glastonbury Abbey, and they suggest that some of the early saints came here. So they talk about St Patrick coming here to Glastonbury, St Bridget of Ireland, and also St David of Wales. Now, if they came here, that would have been between about 450 and 550 AD. So perhaps those early buildings really were part of an early Christian community. But the archaeology starts around 700 with a stone church being built here for the first time by an early king of Wessex. And then over the next few hundred years, during the Saxon period, the abbey grows, it acquires land, and it steadily becomes more wealthy and more important. Now, by the time that the Normans invaded from France in the year 1066, Glastonbury had already become the wealthiest abbey in England. And by that time, 3 kings were buried here as well. So it just gives you a sense of how important it was. Now, Glastonbury did very, very well during the Norman period. It carried on growing, it became more important, and then there was a big, big setback. And the problem came in the form of a large fire. Many of the buildings burned down, many buildings damaged. And so the monks really had to start almost again from scratch. And they needed a little bit of outside help. And help came from the king. And at this time in history, it's King Henry II. And so he sent one of his own top people here with a purse of money, and that person stayed here and supervised the construction of a new chapel after the fire. And the chapel is the building over here. So let's move closer to that building.
Hayaan mo na. Hayaan mo na. Hayaan mo na. Oo. Oo, sige. Sige, sige. Naka-live ako eh. Naka-live ka ba? Oo. Sina?
Hindi yan, tree na yan.
Ito.
Yun.
Ay, iyan nga pala, pero... Halika, halika. Oo, ito nga. Ito nga.
Yan nga. Mabuhay pa yan.
Oo, kada Christmas. O sige, sige. Ako muna, ipasa nyo mamaya sa akin, ha?
O, akin na yung... Naka-live ka ba?
Naka-live.
Ay, alis ka na dyan. Meron na dyan. Akin na ni.
Picturean mo ko dyan mamaya, ha? Dito.
Oh.
Picture kayong dalawa. Bilis, bilis, bilis. Diyan na sa kanya. Ipasa na lang, Ginoo. Smile. Against the light? Oo, against the light. Wait, wait. Yan. O, picturean mo ako dito sa nag-iisang akala natin. Ay, siya na, hindi pala. Sus, Ginoo.
Para marinig natin yan. Oh, hawakan mo ako.
At least may remembrance tayo doon. Ipasa nyo mamaya sa akin yan. Eh, paano mo mapasa? Hindi nyo alam number ko. Ilagay mo number ko dyan. 07. Ano mo? Messenger. Mamaya kasabas tayo. Hindi natin marinig. Alam mo na, at least, huli naman yan. Ay, huli yun. Ayan yung mga wildflowers. Hindi, kaya Disyembre lang daw yung talaga ng ano, nabibigay ng dahon. Yung anak natin. So we are going to Lady Chapter. Lady Chapter.
Scheme was bright yellow, bright red, and bright blue, as well as green, white, and black. Now, this blue was called ultramarine, and it was made from crushed lapis lazuli imported from Afghanistan. This was a very, very expensive material, and they painted the whole of the ceiling over the altar with this very expensive. And into that, they started, you looked up into that ceiling, you could see the bright blue with silver and gold stars in it. So this would have been a very beautiful chapel. Now the underground part of this building takes us back to the story of Joseph, because in the 1400s, Glastonbury Abbey became hugely popular with the pilgrims coming here for Joseph of Arimathea. So eventually they excavated under the building and created a chapel underground dedicated to Joseph. By now, of course, he was Saint Joseph. So this was a measure of the popularity of that story that we talked about at the beginning of the tour. There had been no daylight underground. This would have been a completely underground chapel, lit by candles, probably quite mysterious for the pilgrims that visited it. So we're going to head out into the churchyard now.
Sorry po.
Okay, right. Some of you will have already heard we're about to talk about Arthur. So we have the churchyard here beneath our feet, and this is where the next story comes from. And it's the story of King Arthur and Queen Guinevere being found here buried in the churchyard. Now we're still just after the fire. The king's helped by building us the chapel over here, but otherwise all the buildings still need to be reconstructed. Visitors aren't coming, the monks haven't got a lot of money. So things are still pretty bad. And the king comes back to them a second time with some further help. And this time it's in the form of a story. The king says he's heard from an old Welsh storyteller that buried in the churchyard here is none other than Arthur and Guinevere. So of course they get digging to see what they can find. And the monks dig deep into the churchyard and they find a casket deep down, about 4 meters down. And on top of that casket, a lead cross, a metal cross. And it's got a Latin inscription on it. And the Latin inscription reads, "Here lies the renowned King Arthur buried on the Isle of Avalon." So the monks open the casket and they describe in great detail what they find. Now they say that there are 2 occupants, one of them very tall, very big boned. Around the head marks the battle wounds. And so this, they say, is the remains of the warrior King Arthur. And then next to him, a much smaller, much more slender figure. And this time the monks say the bones are of great beauty, and around the skull the remains of fine golden hair. And so this, they say, has to be Queen Guinevere. Now what they're doing, of course, is they are creating a very exciting story. It catches the imagination of the people at the time who love the Arthurian stories, and it gets people coming back to Glastonbury Abbey. And as these people come to see the bones of Arthur and Guinevere, so of course they bring their money with them. It gets things moving here. We think that this might have been made up by the monks in order to help them out of this trouble they were in immediately after the fire. So who knows? But it was a sensational story, and it got people coming here for hundreds of years afterwards. And indeed, we even get people coming here today simply because of the story of Arthur and Guinevere. Okay, so within a few years of the discovery of Arthur and Guinevere, the monks begin to rebuild the main church. Now the main church is this area up here, so we're going to have a walk up there next.
Diba? Sabi ko na sir. Cloister.
So again, I'm just waiting for everyone to gather.
Nag-aantay daw siya sa inyo, please.
Please, closer.
Double time. Malapit ng uwian.
Okay, everybody, so we're now in the heart of the great church. Now, it takes a lot of imagination. There's not a lot left here today. But this church would have been like the great cathedrals. So I don't know if you visited any of the cathedrals, but that's the kind of building that we would have had here. And it took a long time to build. It was about 130 to 140 years before the church was complete. So at this time in history, that's probably about 5 generations. Now, it was built of the finest stone that the monks got from their own quarry up on the hills close by. And they also had the finest craftsmen to help them construct the church. So these would have been the stonemasons, the carpenters, and of course many, many labourers as well. Now, when they finished the church, they didn't stop there. As you might expect, they also did a lot of altar-raised, build a link building. So that building we were in a few moments ago, that became linked to the church by a building known as the Galilee. And then over here, on this side of the church, was a grand porch, a grand entrance. And they built that so that they could welcome all of these pilgrims into the church. Now, if you look at the arch here, that's broken, of course. If you join it in your mind's eye, it would join about 1/3 higher than where it is today. And that's the internal high church, the inside of the church. So it gives you a sense of how grand and how tall this structure would have been. Now, the tower sat over these pillars of stone. That would have been twice as high as the church tower of St. John's. So if you just have a quick look through the trees at the tower of St. John's, you can think twice as high for our tower over here.
Yeah.
Now let's head up into the choir and then we can talk a little bit more about Arthur and Guinevere.
Tignan mo yan, oh. Taas nyo, no? Doblehan mo.
Naku, yung anak natin nawawala. Don't touch. Sabihin mo sa kanya, mama, i-touch niyo yun.
Hindi ka giniginaw, Rose?
Hindi po.
Wow.
Makapal ang balat ko eh. Hindi ako nagkaka-goosebumps. Look. Never.
Kaway naman kayo dyan.
Kaway, kaway. Sa may mga kamay.
Was age, yes.
Wow.
So this is where Arthur and
That's how
Guinevere
King
were
Actor
buried.
come.
Can we dig them up right now?
They're not there anymore, I'm afraid.
Did the monks find them?
The monks buried them here. I'll tell you a little bit more about it in a minute.
Did someone find them?
I'll tell you the story in a minute.
Kuha mo binang picture. Yun. Yung ganun. Place. Yan, pahalang para ano maganda.
So if you remember, I mentioned that it took about 130, 140 years to build the church.
Yeah.
So even while they were still building the church, this part of the church was finished, brand new, and they immediately placed here a special tomb for Arthur and Guinevere. And we know, luckily, from eyewitness accounts at the time, that it was a black polished marble sarcophagus, and it sat on 4 white marble lions. It had a cross at the head and a carving of Arthur at the foot. So very, very grand. And of course, this is where the monks gathered to chant their offices, their mass, 8 times during each 24-hour period. And the whole point of placing Arthur and Guinevere here is so they would be present for every mass ever sung again at Glastonbury Abbey. Now, the king and queen at this time in history were King Edward I and his queen Eleanor of Castile. And Eleanor came from what's now modern Spain. Now, the two of them came here because they loved the Arthurian legends, and they joined the monks on the Easter of 1278, and they were here for 5 days.
Longer.
And during that time, they took part in a grand ceremony where the bones of Arthur and Guinevere were placed into this brand new tomb. Many thousands of visitors came here for that grand occasion. It would have been one of the largest gatherings that ever took place at Glastonbury Abbey. And we know that King Edward I placed a casket with the bones of Arthur into the tomb, and Queen Eleanor of Castile placed the casket with the bones of Guinevere into the tomb. There they stayed right up until the abbey closed some 250 years later. So the abbey closed in the year 1539, and it closed because of a great change in religion that had happened in England at that time. The king, King Henry VIII, he rejected the Catholic faith and the authority of the Pope in Rome and set up a new church, which was called the Church of England. And so what happened was that over the next few years, the king had all of the monasteries closed down, and he took their money and he took their land. And so that's what happened here. And sadly, when the abbey closed, the tomb disappeared. So we don't know if it was just taken away or if it was broken up. We just don't know, but the tomb and the bones disappear. So now it's just a mystery to us what happened. Okay, so what we'll do next is we're going to head over towards the domestic part of the abbey where the monks lived and worked. I'll tell you a little bit about the monks and how they lived here, and then we'll head down towards the kitchen, and we will take you into an original building. Okay?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, in a way, we have modern pilgrims here as well, because some people that come here for Arthur and Guinevere will leave flowers at this place or sprinkle petals, and that's what you can see down here.
Here's the flower.
Sa kitchen. Let's go, let's go.
It is old, the Great Fire of London. Do you know when the Great Fire of London was?
Thank you, thank you.
I think it was, if I remember correctly,
At least na-share ko sa inyo, di ba?
1665 or 1666.
Malamig din dito, malamig din.
And this
Pero
abbey has
kasi
been
pag
closed
naglalakad
for
dito,
over 100 years by then.
So,
No, this would have been a
east
covered
walk
walkway.
of the cloister. Oh, I love him. He asks a lot of questions.
You can see over here better. Yeah, that's a seat. Yeah. Okay, how are we doing? We're doing well. Good.
Hope you too.
I think there used to be a wolf here.
Sabi niya yan, diyan sa likod ninyo eh, parang kung ilang taon na ulit. Yun muna natin.
Hindi ko.
Okay, got a few still coming. Wait a little bit longer and then we'll get started.
They're senior citizens.
Okay, I think most of us are here.
Yeah.
So we're right in the heart of the domestic buildings here. The monks here were Benedictines, and we know that there were between 50 and 80 monks living and working here at Glastonbury Abbey, and they would be supported, looked after by over 100 servants. So it was quite a big community. And the rules of the Benedictines actually set out what buildings should be here and how they'll be laid out in a plan on the ground. And the idea was that one monastery would look very much the same as another. Now, right at the heart of life would have been the cloister, and the cloister had a garden in the middle. That garden was a quadrangle. And can you imagine covered walkways all the way around the quadrangle? And then the buildings tended to be constructed straight off the cloister. So over here in the east, we had the chapter house. And the chapter house was a meeting house where all the monks would gather every morning to discuss the business of the day. And they might discuss what might be going to affect the monks as a community. They would deal with disciplinary matters. They might receive visitors and even petitions from the public. Now, right next to that meeting house was their sitting room. And the sitting room had a fire going all the time. And this was the only building in the monastery that the monks had access to that had a fire going. So can you imagine during the autumn, the winter, the spring, a lot of the time it would have been cold and damp in these buildings. So that sitting room would have been really, really important to our monks here. And then over in this area was a very long building, 2 stories high, and the monks' dormitory was on the first floor. So this would be where they'd sleep. One long room, beds down either side, most of the monks sleeping in that one room. And then at the very far end, the toilet block. And so the toilet block was right out the way at the back of the buildings, and it was also close to the monks' dormitory, so it was all quite well thought out. Now over here you're looking down into a cellar, and that's the cellar of the refectory or dining room. So this is where our monks would gather 3 times a day for their meals. They'd eat generally simple food. They would sit at wooden benches and tables in complete silence while somebody read to them from the scriptures, from the Bible. And the food that they ate, well, it was very largely shaped by the date in the calendar. So if it was an ordinary day, very simple food, usually vegetarian. If it was a saint's day or a religious holiday, they might have finer food. They might drink wine instead of ale. They might have meat on the table. So this is how the monks' sort of daily lives would have revolved around what significance the day in the calendar really had. Each monk was entitled to a pound of the best quality bread a day and 8 pints of ale. Now the ale they drank was very weak, and the process of brewing it killed off all the bacteria in the water. So what it was really about was finding something safe to drink. It wasn't so much about drinking beer for the sake of it, it was drinking something that was safe to drink. But it was quite a pleasant drink. I've actually tried this weak beer. It was called small beer, and it's actually really pleasant. So we know they grew a lot of their own food here. They had 2 different vegetable gardens. They had a herb garden and a flower garden. In addition to that, a large orchard with apples and pears, and also a vineyard. They even made a small amount of their own wine here. Anything they didn't grow, they could get from the farms and estates that they owned. So all around this area would have been extensive farms and estates owned by the Abbey, and they would have been able to get extra food that they needed from these estates. All right, so a lot of the time and the energy would have gone into feeding everybody here, because you had 80 monks having 3 meals a day. You had another 100 servants who probably had at least 1 meal a day as part of their sort of package of employment, shall we say. And then the abbot, who was in charge, might have guests fine dining here as well. So a huge amount of time and resource went into feeding everyone. So let's head down to the abbot's quarters.
So long na!
Single yan. Normal
Oh
single
my
yan.
god. No.
Ligawan mo na kasi.
Yung iyon na. Bagay oh.
Malayo.
Malayo daw.
Tingin.
Ikaw na lang ang lumapit ng tingin.
Kasi Cellar, ikot-ikot lang tayo. Ano importante dito? Sightseeing. There's no wrong.
No, I'll show you. We're going there in a minute, and then I'll explain it to you. I'll just stop here and tell you a little bit about the abbot.
Malit yung baboy sa loob.
Right, we've entered the abbot's precinct, or the abbot's quarters. Now the abbot's in charge here. He's elected by the monks. Once he's elected, he can, if he wants to, stay for life. They have to elect somebody they trust, who's going to look after their interests. And it's often the number 2, the prior, that becomes the next abbot, because he's already shown he's capable of looking after the place. So in that sense, it's all very modern, much like an employment place today might be. So the abbot has a very fine house, which is just over here, 2-story dwelling, very fancy. This is where he entertains some of the important guests, the visitors to the abbey. And he's got a nice garden, which is in this area. And the garden looks over towards his kitchen, which is this building here, built in the 1300s. So we'll go in there in a minute. But he also had a big feasting hall. So on the ground here was a huge building, which was a 2-story building, a feasting hall where the abbot could entertain. Now the last abbot here, a man called Richard Whiting, he had a banquet in that feasting hall for 500 people, and in his journal he describes them as persons of fashion. So he's deliberately inviting the A-listers of the Tudor period, if you like. Now, we also know that there were a number of royal visits here. We had King Edward I, as I told you when we were up at Arthur's tomb. We also had a visit from King Edward III and his wife Queen Philippa. And then towards the end of the Abbey's history, a visit from King Henry VII. Now these visits would have cost the Abbey an absolute fortune. We know that on one of these visits, it cost the Abbot about £250,000 in today's money to entertain the King and his entourage for a few days. So you wouldn't want too many royal visits.
Exactly.
Now, remember I said this was the wealthiest abbey in the land. So these were almost like the prestige head offices It's like the equivalent of the big glass towers today in our cities. The abbot was so important he was made a lord. So he would often be away on business in London, where he was sat in the House of Lords, which was part of the government, of course. So all these things are just showing how rich and important Glastonbury was. So let's head down into the kitchen and I'll tell you a little bit more about that building.
Kainan na guys, kainan na. Kainan na, kainan. Hapunan na, may lugaw dun. Hindi, lechon naman, lechon. Lechon nandoon. Balik tayo dito guys. Sa kitchen. The Abbott's kitchen. 14th century.
No electric light.
Do sit down if you'd like to.
Okay, thank you.
Ay, salamat. Sa wakas.
Oh my God. My arms.
Saan ka ba? Nag-electro na sila, oh. Yan ang magandang lechon, maliliit. Don't touch.
Behave, guys.
Nearly everyone's in. There's plenty of seats over here if anyone wants to sit. Right, so a little bit about this building then. Nearly finished. You don't have to be patient much longer. So this building was built in the early 1300s, so it's about 700 years old, and it's quite important architecturally. There's only 2 buildings like this left in the world. It's quite clever. If you look at the corners, each one has a different fireplace. Over in this corner they would do the washing up because there's drainage, so they could pour the dirty water away. Over in this corner they'd be boiling things in water. So they might be boiling vegetables, for example. Over here is where the meats were roasted, a large rotisserie. And then in the far corner, there's a patisserie oven. So this was where the pies and pastries were made. Now imagine just through those doors, 2 more buildings. One was the brew house, where they brewed the ale, the beer. And the other was the bakehouse, where they made all the bread. Now, this would be where all of the fine food for the Abbott's entertainments was created. And you can see we've got this large workspace in the middle, fireplaces all around us, and then we've got this rather curious gantry here behind me. This was originally made in stone or wood, we're not quite sure, but it would be where the chef would walk up and down, looking at what was going on below him and shouting out instructions to the servants working in the kitchen. So this would be sort of master chef medieval style. You can imagine the chef shouting at all of the servants below. Now the clever part of the building is this lantern structure above us. What happened is when all the heat came out into the room from the fires, the heat would rise up the side of the building and out of these 8 apertures above us. Meanwhile, cool air would drop down from that central hole and come down into the building, and you get this circulation of air around the building. And it kept it at a good temperature for the people to work in here. So it helped keep it cool. Okay, so the last little piece of the tale, the closure. We mentioned King Henry VIII, how he closed down all of England's religious houses. So after the Abbey closed, we closed, you might remember, 1539, I think I said. After the Abbey closed, all the monks had gone away, the king's men would have stripped out all of the wealth from the church, and they would have sold anything that would raise funds for the crown, for the king. And then eventually, after months of work, when they'd stripped everything out, they'd leave the buildings as empty shells and go away. And what happened here was eventually these buildings were used as a stone quarry. So the buildings were pulled down and people would buy the stone to go away and build new houses, new farms, even new roads. And so this is why we have so little of our original buildings left here today. Now, ultimately, by the early 1900s, the ruins were bought by the Church of England. And the Church of England were the first people to treat it as a proper historic site. So what they did was they worked on the ruins to make sure that they weren't going to collapse. And they also started archaeology, so excavations started here for the first time. And then that brings us back towards the present day, where we're now a modern charitable organisation. So that's all from me, but if you would like to ask any questions, then this is a good time. Anybody get any questions?
I'm so curious how the home looked like before. Does your outfit represents?
Right, okay, so my outfit is the outfit from the Anglo-Saxon period, so much earlier than these buildings. My outfit would have been worn by a wealthy person, let's say 1,000 years ago, shall we say. It's not a monk's outfit, brown woolen habits, as they call it. I'm not dressed as a religious person.
Okay. Question?
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for coming to visit us today and for coming on the tour.
Thank you
Do
so
enjoy the
much.
rest of your visit.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Sorry? There wasn't really warfare.
Miss Ivy.
But there wouldn't have been warfare.
You will take the picture.
Oh, yes.
No. That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's so interesting.
I'm gonna use it on my blog.
Can we take a
Thank you
picture?
very much.